Cassie, have you heard of anybody that's planning on being late or not coming today?
No, I haven't heard from anyone.
Okay. I had some connection problems this morning, so we can get started, I imagine, since we're a couple minutes after. Welcome, everybody. We are going to kick off this March meeting of the Environment and Climate Committee with a roll call. So I'm going to say your name and then tell me that you're here. Bill.
Here.
Covey. Covey looks like he's frozen, but is here. Kersey.
Here.
Mark.
Here.
Neil is here. Peter.
Here.
Rory.
Here.
Serena.
Here.
Ex officios, Anne or Sasha.
Sasha's here.
Great, thank you, Sasha. And then Covey's still connecting to audio.
I am here. I'm having some technical
perfect.
issues, but I'm here.
Yeah, no worries. And then is Kelly here? It doesn't look, it looks like committee member Kelly Jensen is absent. So we will jump into the approval of minutes. Does anybody have any comments from last month's minutes that we need to discuss? Hearing none. Is anybody willing to make a motion to approve the February 10th minutes?
I move to approve the February 10th minutes.
Okay, and I'll second.
Great. Moved by Rory, seconded by Bill. All in favor, raise your Zoom hands. And I see no vote from Covey or Peter.
Oh.
Peter, okay, but Covey's frozen.
I think we're done already.
No worries. With Covey gets reconnected, we'll check, but that's basically everybody. That's 7 of the 8 present. All right. So the next section is public comment. Kayla is going to run the public comment section of the meeting, and it looks like we do have 2 attendees. So hopefully they'll have something to share.
And I think one of the attendees is Councilor Campbell, who we're working on getting over into the main meeting. So Councilor Campbell, I think we sent you a link, or Kayla. Oh, but Kayla got her. Perfect.
Yep,
okay.
She is over and should be able to connect here shortly. And good afternoon. It looks like we do have one caller, Doreen. I have given you the ability to unmute yourself. And just another reminder, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. All of you are working so hard to meet the environmental needs, wants, and requirements of our traffic congestion, growing pains, greenhouse gas reductions, and mandates. It appears most city meetings have nothing to do with the city-owned Bend Municipal Airport. What a shame. You can't do enough work to offset the massive emissions and airborne lead unabatedly pumped upwind over farms, families, wildlife, schools in the city. Considering studies on impacts of noise, vibration, lead, and pollution, coupled with location of unreasonably low flight paths and endless training loops directly over homes within a couple of miles of city center. Though farms are not in the UGB, the city is taking farms to expand both airport and city boundaries. Once farms are paved over, the soil is forever altered and damaged. I ask you to consider how much more farmland will be lost to accommodate increased road traffic and the redistribution of lead and other undeniably harmful toxicants via crops and feed animals ingestions. How many humans on these acquired farms ended up with lifetime effects from general aviation growth if they survived? Who's checking into that? In all of the protections Where are the farm protections? UGB changes keep pushing predominantly into farmland. There's a tremendous amount of info on the long-term benefits of small farms for community health and vitality. As you continue addressing our seemingly insurmountable growing pains, please remember taking small farms 10, 20, and 100 acres at a time is not simply the easiest place to expand for the greater good while carrying long-term destruction of soils and vitality. Please honor our small farms as the vital sources of the community environment they are. Don't cut off farm water and land and provide to large polluters. Once again, I'm asking you to review the EPA's 2017 pollution reports, which have Ben Muni as #2 for lead pollution in the state and in top national list too. Yet I'm not even mentioning the other 200 plus pollutants in the fuels these aircraft use, which are endlessly pumped over our farms, homes, schools, wildlife, environment, and humans. Finally, I'm again beseeching you to review and take tangible action with information on San Jose Reed Hillview. Thank you.
Does not look like we have any more callers. So I will hand this back to you, Neil.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kayla, and thanks, Doreen, for your public comment. So we are going to, I'm on the right set. Yeah, we're gonna go into updates. We have a couple updates, Cassie.
Sorry. I don't actually have any updates that won't be covered elsewhere in the meeting, but I did want to mention that I think we will have an opportunity as a committee to revisit if we want to go to in-person meetings or stay virtual meetings or hybrid meetings pretty soon here. I don't think I would be ready to do that as soon as April, but I think perhaps by May, and certainly by the summer, if things continue, trending the way they are. So I guess I'm kind of curious, maybe for just a general feel, if committee members are interested in in-person meetings or if people would like to stick to virtual meetings. And I do think hybrid will be an option. We haven't figured out the technology perfectly yet. And I think probably as many of you have experienced, like I do know that the technology for hybrid meetings isn't terrific yet. Maybe we'll find a really good solution for that. But so I think that may be an option, but I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. So maybe if anyone just wants to chime in and just share like how they're feeling, because I don't have a gauge on where you're all at, if you like the virtual or not. And if we went to in person, we could also revisit the time that we meet if the middle of the day doesn't work as well for people to like leave. Just really quick, because we didn't save a discussion time for this, but just getting a feel. Bill?
It's funny you brought it up because I was going to ask if you didn't bring it up. I can't wait, but I know we have to be careful, but I think it'll be much more cohesive group if we can see each other.
Kelly?
Yeah, well, I see the benefits of being.
Oh, for some reason, you're.
Sorry. I see the benefit of being there in person. There are challenges for those of us who have the 9-to-5 jobs of being there in person. Having that flexibility makes it just a little bit easier.
Does anyone else have opinions either way?
I kind of agree with Kelly. Like if there's any way to have the hybrid model that works for everyone, I think that would be a great compromise.
Peter?
I've learned to roll with the punches, but all things being equal, I'm comfortable being in person, and I think there's some benefits to that kind of communication.
Neil?
Yeah, similarly, I imagine any return will involve a learning process, and an in-person meeting, just with a group of this size and this being none of our, being a volunteer capacity, I think that realistically somebody will probably not be able to make it in person or have to join remotely anyways. So I think we can figure that out as we try it, but I'm happy to do it. I think this group, especially since we've formed in the during COVID without ever meeting as a large group, would benefit a lot from being able to meet in person.
Kirsty?
Yeah, I'm also open to meeting in person, but I would be interested in just learning some of what the city's planning on, like, if you have an exposure to COVID, how all of that works. Are we distancing? Are we not? Just kind of what those norms become over the next couple of months with city staff.
Okay, that sounds good. So I think what I'm hearing is that there is general interest in meeting together in some capacity, but also a definite interest in maintaining like a hybrid or virtual option, which is kind of what I figured. So yeah, more to come on that. We're working internally to kind of figure out what the options are, since it's all very new. But so hopefully over the next few months we can have an update on that. But definitely April virtual, fully virtual, and then maybe by May we'll have a hybrid option. And then that's it for me from the updates.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up. I look forward to hopefully seeing you all sometime in the next couple months. So we can jump into the next item on our agenda, which is an action item. I believe Kirsty is going to lead this section of the agenda, which is talking about a recommendation around the home energy score component of the CCAP.
All right. All right, awesome, great. So we've got just a couple slides here to give you an update of where our subgroup stands. So we have spent some time really trying to get up to speed with the home energy score program. Where do some of the key stakeholders stand after the last couple of years? What evidence has been collected? Really just trying to understand where other cities are at with this too, what they've collected as regard to a voluntary or mandatory program, and really get up to speed. So Cassie sent out a lot of really good information about that. So I won't go into too many details, but this is an overview of what we have found. And we've been listening and reading a lot of emails from realtors and community members as well. And just seeing a clear understanding that with voluntary programs, they're not getting the numbers that are the goals that really make a program worth implementing. So that's where the evidence was leading us. So moving forward with this conversation, and after I present a couple slides, I want to make it clear that we're the Environment Climate Committee. We're trying to keep that lens as we were meeting and discussing to stay focused on the issues that we're here to address. There are a lot of nuances with implementing any program that I think can be addressed in different stages by different people, but really trying to stay focused on, is this beneficial to the CCAP goals, to the environment, and does it meet some equity benchmarks that the city and the ECC both share? Okay, we can go to the next slide. So Cubby was really helpful with bringing our conversation back to why we're looking at this program, why it is a program. And we came back to these 2 points. This is being looked at and was originally looked at to see if it helps to reduce carbon emissions and to achieve the CCAP's carbon reduction goals. So bringing that back, circling that back really helped our conversation stay focused on that. With an education program like this is, it has the ability to increase transparency and make important information available, whether you're selling or buying your house, and making those decisions within the first, I think Neil brought this point up of people make a lot of changes to their homes within the first 2 years of owning it. So wanting to get that information in front of them immediately. Right, we can go to the next slide. So our recommendation is to fully implement the home energy score program. The vocabulary used is to make it mandatory. And ultimately, the evidence shows that with the voluntary program, you're not reaching those numbers. So it was kind of like, well, is it really even worth investing in if your numbers are so low in the small percentages? So ultimately, it does need to be required in order for it to be worth the effort. And really just honing in the report to the Portland City Council. I pulled a quote from there. The home energy score reveals opportunities for Portland housing stock to become safer, healthier, and more efficient and less air and carbon polluting. It's similar to putting miles per gallon listing on a car. You need to have that information. It doesn't mean that those cars with low miles can't be sold. They are sold all the time. It just gives the person buying it the information to make a decision. And it is proven that this shift is helping to get that information in front of people and start making shifts in these cities. That's what I have.
And to clarify a little bit of context too, I should have started with this for you all, is that what for the home energy score program, what we asked the subgroup to do is to first, as kind of an interim step, determine whether the committee wanted to recommend that a program that is mandatory in nature, like a program that requires a home energy score for homes at the time of listing, if they want to pursue that type of program, or like a voluntary, more education-based, they're both education-based programs, but a voluntary program. And we're doing that as a first step because that was definitely a controversial kind of point of discussion when the CCAP was originally discussed. And the next steps, depending on which program is pursued, the next steps are very different. So we kind of wanted to get the committee to wrap their heads around those two options. Then if the full committee kind of agrees on the path that the subgroup has recommended, we're going to do a check-in with the council stewardship subcommittee to make sure that the council also kind of agrees with that direction. But we're not done with the home energy score at that point. If there's agreement among all those levels, then what would come next is actually developing the program, kind of specifying some of the program parameters. If it was a required program, there would be an ordinance involved. If it was a voluntary program, it would be some type of other structure to support that type of program. So that's kind of what you're all supposed to discuss today is this interim first step. Like, are we comfortable moving forward with the program that the work group has recommended?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. And there's a lot of sensitivity around the vocabulary, the wording around mandatory and, and the additional work that this brings. And so as a subgroup, just trying to focus on, what do we want to bring to the full ECC to help move this conversation along and doing some of that background research, and then open that up to decide today if we're ready to make a full recommendation. And then Cubby and I will be meeting with the stewardship committee in a couple of weeks. So just wanting to hear questions from the full committee. I believe we have the ability to take a vote today. So we can just work through some questions there. I think what I struggled with is there are a lot of nuts and bolts of within a program of how to make it function the best for our community. And ultimately, with the nature of a voluntary committee, like we are just trying to table those of, we recommend that whoever is leading this program implementation brings in those stakeholders to really hear from them and get some input on what details within the program will help make this really successful in our community.
Do you want to lead this conversation, Kirsty, or do you want help?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Okay, great.
Rory, I think I saw your hand go up first.
Thanks, Kirsty. I found the resources that were provided today pretty convincing that the benefits of the mandatory home energy score program are pretty strong. the data from Portland and Berkeley and a little bit from Minneapolis. But I did want to ask, I know that there are critiques of a mandatory program. Do we know of any studies, information, data that talk about any downsides that have come from these programs that have been implemented? We hear about effects on affordability or lack of qualified technicians to do the home energy score. Is there data to support some of those critiques that we're hearing?
I'm not familiar with any data to support those. I think what we're seeing on these cities that have implemented mandatory programs, that they were able to address those concerns and really minimize the impact of any concerns. So around affordability, making sure that as it's implemented, that there are opportunities for people in low income housing to have those fees waived. Things like that are pretty standard now with home energy score programs. Another concern that gets brought up is really making sure that the people doing the inspections are trained well. And so that's a part of the implementation that we need to make sure is fully covered, that they have all the tools that they need to have a consistent inspection.
Rory, Peter here. I was on this subcommittee. I think, and I've been involved in home scoring and home performance for quite a while. I think one tremendous advantage we have here in Bend is that other programs have rolled out before us. So I would say there were some, I don't have any data, but there were hearsay stories of some bumpy starts or some missteps for some of these programs, but that was years ago. And one advantage that we have is learning from those. And I think what we're seeing in the data is the results of well-oiled programs that addressed some of the bumpy starts. Not that they were negative outcomes, but the people who are doing it first learn some lessons.
Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I'm very in favor of this. This looks great. I think it's a no-brainer, but just curious, maybe this is a question even for you, Peter, because you've worked on this. How much do you see the cost varying? And I know we've talked about sort of the fact that an industry will grow around the need for this service, but also is it seen as something that needs potential support or financing help to conduct the scoring? Or are we assuming that this is targeting homes and it's being produced as part of a sale? So it's sort of a sale transaction where there's probably going to be quite a bit of revenue generated anyways. Just sort of curious how you see the cost and the cost burden and where it fits, and if there's anything you all have seen about the cost being an issue.
For sure, there's actually a good deal of data on that. I would also say I just keep reiterating this because I find it's a huge misunderstanding that was put out there related to cost. No measures that are identified in a home energy score are required by anyone to take. So one of the massive cost concerns was like, if they're identified that they have really poor windows, if someone can't afford to put windows in, that would be devastating. There's nothing like that. There's no cost requirement to do any of the measures. It's an informational thing. It tells you order of magnitude of cost, order of magnitude of payback time. So it's informational, it's insightful, but it's not required to do any of those changes. As far as the test itself, both from the data that was reported to us, and you can just go and right now and try to get an energy score, search for needing an energy score. It's very easy to find. There's multiple options, like in the Portland area, the Hillsborough area. The costs are driven by the size of the home, which kind of makes sense, but it varies from a low. So the average number we're getting pretty consistently is around $125 for this score. If you were in a really large home, it could push 200. If you're in a really small home, it's closer to 100. And most of the programs I researched, you can income qualify to get that covered by a fund allocated for that purpose. So we very much looked into the equity component of this and felt very comfortable that well-developed programs do not create an equity issue.
Thanks. That's really helpful and much lower cost than I expected.
Neil, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, I guess, both pose the question and clarify of that the component that we were asked to evaluate first is, should a program be developed that is mandatory or voluntary? And then there are other questions in terms of implementation and goals around, like, what about low income? What's included in a test? Are we using existing protocols? Are we creating our own? Those are all questions. Where would those questions be answered, and kind of on what time frame? Would we have an opportunity as the ECC to weigh in on some of those components, or are we going to be asked to do that in the future? That's a open question for you or Cassie.
So that would be the next step for the ECC. So my guess is we would start with the subgroup if the subgroup is still willing to meet to do that. My kind of like tentative timeline was that we'd probably take most of the rest of the year to develop that. So by hopefully by the end of this year, the committee would be recommending the full program, which to the council. So the council isn't even making any like decision now. The council decision will still be at the end of the year, and all those things you brought up is what we would work on next. And doing that would involve a lot of community engagement, which we talk about through the subgroup, what kind of community engagement we want to do for that, and further research.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I just want to, I guess, caveat that because this is the only thing that we're voting on, there are lots of different models of scoring things, what's included. So I don't want to get too specific on our expectations of what the costs are. Like, we have really good examples that we can draw from during program design, but that we don't know what the program is yet. So we can't be fully confident in whatever those pieces are.
Yeah, I think what'll be helpful getting a vote today is our subgroup can then move forward of what we recommend based on it being mandatory or voluntary. And then we're meeting with the stewardship committee soon to get their input as well. Well, if we're focusing on these issues, but they want us to focus on these issues, we need to get on the same track. And then be able to move forward and not only provide a recommendation, but also, with these bullet points under it as implementation happens.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think I'm fully supportive.
Bill?
So something you said, Kirsty, earlier about mandatory versus voluntary. I mean, the information looks like you can put a lot of effort into a program and have it be voluntary and not get really any results. So I'm hoping that we as a committee recommend that this is mandatory. I mean, I think it's not worth doing if we don't do it. It won't be successful.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. We made a real effort to get away from the word mandatory and looked at how do you do an incentive program, but that still puts you under the voluntary pillar that just isn't getting those results. And if we could go back a couple of years, I think even before COVID, and know the weight of this word, I would love to do that. But we're working with what we have, and hopefully, our community can see that too. Mark?
Just on that point about voluntary versus mandatory, there'd be some strong adverse selection there that if you're going to have a bad score, you're not going to opt in. So
yeah,
I feel like a good voluntary kind of program personally.
Just process-wise, I don't know if you have prepared an example of what you think the motion might be, but I think it might be helpful as we move further through conversation that if we can see that, so then if there's any clarifying questions, we can get those settled before we actually take a vote on this.
I have an option to work with that I can put up. Although even looking at it again now, I'm realizing it's maybe a little too specific. So the one that I recommended, I said that requires disclosure at the time of listing, because that's how all the programs I've seen, that's like the way that you make it mandatory is by requiring it when you're selling it. So I guess to make it, I think that would be fine, but if you guys want to consider other types of ways to enforce that element that don't require disclosure at the time of listing, we can take that part out. I just don't know of any programs that do that in a different way.
Peter, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just had a clarification with Neil, your comment on the program, kind of what are the parameters of the program. You know, all of our research we were doing is kind of based on a program that is using as a groundwork the Department of Energy Home Energy Score program. Are you considering that there's broader options?
Oh no, that was just an open question. If that's what all of the examples are, then that we're operating off of, and there's reasons. I just haven't been involved in the process, so I wasn't sure if there were other options being evaluated.
Yeah, so I guess my comment there is, I feel that it would be important to use the Department of Energy model, at least as a foundation or groundwork, and each municipality can kind of tweak on the details and the implementation. But I think for the benefit of people moving around, moving around the country, that some kind of a general standardization has tremendous value, so that people are understanding the same number and a kind of a relative same meaning to that number. I would be more concerned if we tried to invent our own program, that would be a bigger lift and maybe have less value. So I was just curious about your comment, and our assumptions and our research and our outcomes and everything were based on all the programs have some kind of a grounding in the Department of Energy Home Energy Score program.
Great.
Cubby?
So I have some comments on the motion, and I just want to give an update as well. So I think I brought this up in the past. I think full committee meetings, but especially in the working group meetings as well. From the very start, I wanted to kind of see past the dichotomy of kind of voluntary versus mandatory, even though that is the task kind of in front of us. And I've had a few other meetings, including one yesterday since our last working group discussions, including with realtors and members of CORE who have some concerns with this. And I think one of the concerns that seems apparent to me is that it seems a philosophical concern with having a mandatory program. And so I was wondering if there's a way to amend the motion, or not amend, but basically change the motion before we make the motion, to kind of make it clear that we would be, to move forward with the home score program that requires maybe reasonable disclosure, or something that basically says that we are going to work on the implementation of this to make sure it's reasonable. So we're going to work to make sure it's the disclosure is mandatory, but we're going to make sure that it's done in a reasonable way. So that's something I just wanted to put to the group before we, get to the point where we're passing the motion or voting on motion.
And process-wise, we can continue with whatever conversation we want. So just as a reminder, we kind of have a modified process of motions in this group, where we will show the language of it, so then we can have conversation beforehand. And if we can reach kind of consensus on that language ahead of time, we don't have to go through a formal amendment and retraction process. So discussion about this amendment is great, and hopefully we can come to language that we all agree on. And then if not, we'll go through the formal process of making a recommendation or making a motion, seconding, and then having to do an amendment or vote on amendments.
Thank you, Neil. That's helpful. And then just to clarify with Cubby that it would read with the home energy score program that requires reasonable disclosure at the time of listing.
I would be open to the committee's wordsmithing on that, because I don't want to say that the disclosure itself is reasonable, but I want to make sure that we're kind of committing that we're recommending to the council, and also the council be voting on this, or looking at it as not just we're creating a mandatory program. Because I think one of the takeaways that sometimes happens in terms of just the public part of this is opponents of this sometimes portray it as, oh, there's a mandatory program and we're just going to go ahead and make it mandatory without kind of considering all the parts of it. And I just want to see if there's a way we can make that part of the motion itself, to say that we're recommending a mandatory program or required program that will also take into consideration and be reasonable in its entirety.
Okay. All right, I think we need to take about like 5 to 10 minutes if I'm reading the agenda correctly. So I'm going to move forward. Bill, would you like to go next?
I just want, both with Peter's and Kavi's comments, I'm wondering if it's premature to get into that. That's part of the development of the home energy score program itself. I mean, I think I agree with Peter that we should use existing and well-established programs that are transferable across other parts of the country, and people coming in won't be shocked by bends. They'll be able to accept it. And to Kavi's point, I think the reasonableness of it will come out as it's being developed. And I think maybe at this point, looks like the recommendation is to the stewardship committee, just that we move forward with a mandatory program. And I mean, we're going to have to assume it's going to be reasonable. I mean, would we go forward with an unreasonable one? So I think maybe we don't need to get, I don't think we need to modify it to say requires reasonable disclosure. I think we need to get to the point of it being mandatory or not mandatory. And that's what we're trying to say here by requiring disclosure. So I think it's premature to get into reasonableness and maybe even which program which model we use. But I think we just, I think that's what you're trying to get to here, something to recommend from our committee to the stewardship committee, that we go forward with this and we make it mandatory. And if that's the case, I'm only concerned that the proposed motion is strong enough that it states clearly enough that it's requires means mandatory. And I agree with it. We need to address concerns raised by the community, but that's going to happen as we make it. Or not we aren't going to make it. The city's going to make it. So anyway, I don't think we should water it down with reasonable at this point, or say what one to use. Let's just say we need to do it. So I'm good with the motion as it was originally written, as long as other people think it's strong enough.
Well, I definitely think we're here for both today, to get a vote and to get input, as a member of the subgroup, needing to hear from you all some of this input. So that's all really helpful to hear. Mark?
Yeah, I also think it sounds as if it's already inherently quite reasonable, and I'd be very suspect of groups that are trying to dilute it, given that it's not that costly, especially in the scheme of transaction costs. And this seems like a situation where the only real driver to be opposed to this is if you are trying to hide information or have misinformed buyers. So I would be very reluctant personally to start to open the door to some big tent approach where everyone's going to be happy, because unless there is opposition I haven't heard of yet, it doesn't sound like the financial implication should be that driver. The only thing it would suggest to me is people who are worried that they can't sell a house without people being misinformed about what they're actually getting into. So again, I'm worried. I would not be supportive of language that dilutes it either.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, in my experience, which has been fairly close firsthand in the last few weeks, I say I laud and respect Kavi's efforts in having these conversations, and he's been working to bridge this divide between voluntary and required since the very beginning. In light of recent events, I've come to the conclusion that even if it were the most reasonable program in the world, the simple fact that you are required to do it is the line in the sand. It doesn't really have anything to do with whether it's reasonable or not. So we will anticipate and expect a firestorm by anything that's required or not, because it's fundamentally an ideological issue about the piece of the requirement. It has nothing to do with mitigating the material concerns of a program. That was pretty much flat out said to me by the Government Affairs Council. So while I'm the first peacemaker and I try to go for conversations and I want to incorporate and listen to stakeholders, it was a hard line in the sand about whether it's required or not. And we can try to work with that or talk about it, but that's going to be the end all of whether we get the loud pushback or not. Unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion it's not the merits of the program, it's whether it's required or not. And it's complete with the loudest voices, not every voice. I'm certainly not making a blanket stereotype of every real estate agent. I'm just saying the loudest voices in the group are 100% ideologically driven. That's my takeaway, my personal insights firsthand.
Thank you, Peter. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you so much. I only make these comments to try and save you all time. So it seems to me that there are already programs available that are not mandatory. People can do the federal home energy score on their home if they want to at any time. And then the other question I guess I have for this committee is if you would like to make a recommendation about whether to move forward with a program that's already in place, or do we want to try and come up with our own, decide on our own? Again, in the interest of saving time, if this committee wanted to say that to the stewardship committee, that we also want to know whether we're signing on to something that already exists or creating a new one. Thank you, Chrissy. Thanks.
And one clarifying comment too is that in the CCAP itself, we did actually, the strategy says that we would move forward with the U.S. Department of Energy home energy score. So that was that's been assumed as the model we would use.
Right. Any other comments, Bill?
Well, okay, I don't know if we're ready to move forward with the motion or not, because we're still
that's
clarifying.
what I was checking in on. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because we're starting to discuss maybe the motion itself, so we need to probably make it. But and I do have a question, and then I would be willing to make the motion without the lower bullet on it, but I want to make sure what Cassie just said about the Department of Energy one is assumed. If that's the case, I have a question of whether we should just put that in there in front of that. I mean, I'm kind of contradicting what I said about Peter's comments earlier, but does anybody have I'm willing to make this motion, but I want to make sure if we're going to insert that's the right thing to do. So I'll tell you what, I'll make the motion with that inserted, and then we can discuss it. That's probably the right approach to it. And I think the bullet should be struck at the bottom.
Well, since we have a couple of things that are being considered, since Covey also suggested an amendment, let's not actually make the motion yet, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, let's open the discussion to
Cassie, it's just bothering me because there's a typo. It says at the same of listing. Can you just fix it to say at the time of listing?
Yeah.
So you all have the correct motion in front of you.
Thanks. I kept thinking that too.
And Neil, can I request that you lead the motion part?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, let's take some comments on the language of the motion. Serena?
Yeah, I agree with Bill. I'm glad we brought that up because, yeah, technically it's kind of been assumed U.S. Department of Energy. I think that's really important to place in there. So we're being very distinct in what program we're requiring at the time. I also agree with the comments. I understand Cubby's perception of the bottom, but I also don't think that we should leave a lot of room for continual changes and never getting it across the finish line, if you will, with comments at the bottom. I think there's some way to kind of work through that. That's already part of our plan, is to work with the community and have a lot of discretion in what we're saying and being very transparent along the way as we build out how this will be implemented. So I think that's already kind of part of the plan and doesn't necessarily need to be in this language.
Mark?
I think in terms of language, it's not semantically, it's not that the U.S. Department of Energy program requires disclosure, that we would have a program that requires disclosure of that home energy score. So I think we need to move that down, right? That we would move forward with a program that requires disclosure of, then putting that the U.S. Department of Energy score. So yeah, people.
Okay, let me try.
Yeah, I think it would say, basically say move forward with. Requires disclosure of the, and just leave that there. Right there.
Did that capture it?
I think so. Does that seem right to everyone? Or at least for this sentence. Otherwise, not necessarily.
I think semantically that makes sense. The question that I have is this is just for a process of how the other communities have done it, because are other programs based on the US DOE home energy score program, or is it just that they are straight implementing the DOE home energy score program? So I'm wondering if we need to add the language based on, because we're going to have our own, like, well, I don't know.
It is like an actual tool that is like the home that the U.S. Department of Energy, there's like a software, like a backend tool that you like use. So it's more specific than just basing it on like a framework. It's just that within that tool, there's the tool, but then we have kind of the policy surrounding it. And so the policy surrounding it is kind of what we customize. So if we wanted to, like, not every city in the world does, or every city in the country, offers those subsidizing for a certain income level. Different cities might have different types of homes that are exempt from it. Like if you want to exempt certain affordable housing, that type of thing. So, but that's more of the policy and not the tool itself. So that's where it can be like customized, but then the tool is kind of what it is.
Yeah, I see it exactly right. I see it as there's the home energy score, the actual document you get, and then there's the program, which rolls out how that score is administered and the details of it.
And that would kind of be, by changing it the way we have like a home energy score program, like the program itself is the part that we're kind of customizing, but then what would be required is this is a specific tool. So it's hard to communicate because, it's like terms that, have a lot kind of definition to them.
Yeah, Kavi.
I had a question, and I was trying not to get into the details of this because I know we're just kind of voting on the general broad strokes of whether or not to require it or not at this time, and the recommendation to the stewardship subcommittee for that. But I know I got a lot of feedback from people I talked to about also the value of having utility bills disclosed, and it's something we haven't talked about. I'm sure we'll be discussing that in going forward in terms of implementation of this. But I'm just curious, the language there, it only says requires disclosure of the US DOE home energy score. So if we in the future, if we do agree to require, say, utility bills as part of that, is that still okay? I just want to make sure we're not being too specific in terms of what's required as part of this program, if there's other parts that may be required as well.
I don't think that the language as is would restrict you, because I don't think it would restrict you from doing other things that kind of, again, that would kind of be part of the program parameters.
Could we switch the word from that requires to that includes a required disclosure? So then it's clearly separating home energy score from the program from the tool. Does that work, Cassie and Covey, for that, for just making sure that, because I think the layperson reads those as the exact same thing. The US DOE home energy score and an energy score program is the same thing, but that clarifies that we have two distinct, we're building a program and it has this required component in it. That program will have other guidelines and recommendations and goals. Okay, great.
And just a time check, we're kind of getting, I don't want to cut the discussion short at all, but we are getting kind of short on time in order to make sure we have enough time to get through the rest of our agenda.
Go ahead, Bill.
So I just want to make sure I got this right in my head. So the DOE home energy score is it's a methodology that produces a score. Is that correct? Were we saying, is it a methodology or is it an actual score? Because this is saying we're gonna requiring disclosure of the DOE energy score, not the methodology necessarily. I'm trying to make sure we got it. My question is, are we saying the correct thing here? Is there a home energy score that results from the US DOE method?
Yeah, they're like linked. It's like there's a methodology
and a
put
score.
Measurements into like a tool, and then the tool, you know, spits out a report card that includes a score.
Okay, so as long as that's the case, I think this language looks good. And it's there's three different things up there, but the middle bullet is, I think that looks good to me. And I know we're trying to get to a place and where we make a motion. I'll make the motion as stated there in the middle. You got to get rid of the other stuff, but and somebody can either second it or not, and we can have discussion about it. So I'll make the motion. I think, I don't know what else we need to do to it.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Is it okay if I take over motion-wise, Kersey? Okay, so we haven't done like this involved of a motion with this committee yet. So process-wise, since there have been multiple ideas brought forward, the middle one seems like the most consensus motion that we have up until this point. So is there anybody, we'll have the opportunity to go through the standard process after it's motioned and seconded. If somebody has a strong opinion to this motion or amendment that wasn't shared by the group, but Is there anybody that is not comfortable with us moving forward with this motion? Okay. So then, yes, I will entertain this highlighted motion if somebody wants to make that.
I already did.
Okay.
I made the motion. So
I
somebody.
thought that you made I thought that you said that you were willing to make the motion.
No, I said
but-
I'll make the motion as
Great.
in the bold motion that is on here.
Okay. So Bill makes the motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Kersey seconds. So we're gonna do a roll call vote for this vote. So just quickly, oh, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I just.
Oh, sorry.
It's a process thing. I think you need to ask if there's any discussion of the motion as moved and seconded. Sorry.
Motion has been seconded. Any discussion? Okay. Thanks for all of that pre-discussion. So hearing no discussion, then we'll move to a roll call vote. I'm going to call committee members' names and then just quickly say if you're voting in the affirmative or negative, A or nay. Bill.
Yay.
Covey.
Yay.
Kelly. Kelly, I saw you unmute, but I didn't hear anything.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I can't hear you. Okay, yes, I support.
Okay, that was a little garbled, but I heard yes, I support from Kelly. Kersey.
Yay.
Mark.
Yes.
Neil, yes. Peter.
Yay.
Rory.
Yay.
Serena.
Yes.
Great. So that's all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 members voting in the affirmative. Nice work, team. So we have that recommendation. We can follow up with the group with what our next steps are in recommending that to the stewardship subcommittee. Yeah, nice work working through that and getting language that everybody's comfortable with. So we are going to move on to the next item on our agenda, which is about the voluntary renewable energy tariff with Pacific Power or Pacific Core. So I'll pass it off to Eric or whoever is leading that discussion.
Yeah, and I can intro for a minute. And Eric, do you want to share the slides yourself or do you want me to share them?
Well, I will try. It's not letting me now because because the other presentation is still up. I can try once that one goes down. Okay,
well, I'll stop my share and then I'm just going to intro so you can pull it up while I'm sharing a little bit of background. Okay, so for this topic, I shared a memo with you all about what we're discussing today, but as you all know, we've selected moving forward with a strategy to provide a 100% renewable electricity supply to the community as a top priority for this biennium. So Pacific Power is here today to share more about a program that's being developed that allows for us to make some significant progress on that strategy. For some background, we have been working on this topic with Pacific Power since well before the legislation that passed last year, which established the voluntary renewable energy tariff, which is what we're going to hear about today. To achieve our 100% renewable electricity goal, we've really focused our engagement on Pacific Power because they're the much larger utility in Bend by quite a bit, and their electricity supply is also more heavily fossil fuel based than our other utility, which is Central Electric Co-op. So our electricity from Pacific Power contributes a very substantial portion of our community greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why when we've talked about this 100% renewable electricity supply, we've really focused for the last few years on working with Pacific Power to address their portion of that. So at the time that the CCAP was adopted, Pacific Power was subject to Oregon's renewable portfolio standard, which required them to utilize 50% renewable electricity by 2040. So the estimated greenhouse gas reduction that we show in the CCAP for that strategy was based on the assumption that we would be converting that additional 50% of electricity to renewable energy sources. So we've had many discussions with Pacific Power staff over the last few years, working through ways that we could procure that additional renewable electricity. Things like how would that be billed? Where would the electricity come from? Pacific Power hadn't offered that at the community scale before, so there was just a lot of details and kind of negotiations we were working through and thinking through together in order to make something like that happen. But at the same time as that, a lot of other communities were expressing interest in similar arrangements, and so through cities and some kind of community-based organization groups, there like a lot of momentum grew to officially establish a program that would create a level of consistency around how these programs could work for each community that's interested in them, so that the utilities could offer them as kind of a standard but customizable offering and have some PUC involvement in mediating or regulating certain aspects of it. So before, we were kind of working like just as an individual city, kind of negotiating with Pacific Power. And with the legislation last year, House Bill 2021, it kind of established more of like a formal program. So it's like utilities can offer it. This is how it will be structured. And communities can kind of like have kind of a similar pathway to achieve that. So in the last legislative session, there was this clean energy bill that I referred to. It was kind of a clean energy and energy justice bill that passed. It had a lot of important components to it. A big focus of the bill was around some new requirements that support equity in the energy sector. We're not going to talk about that today, but it was just part of this bigger context. And then the two components that were part of that bill that really impact our 100% renewable electricity strategy. The first component is that there was a new requirement for utilities that they must have zero emissions in their electricity supply in Oregon by 2040. So that changes our baseline assumption from the CCAP about Pacific Power only having 50% renewable, and that our strategy would help us achieve that other 50% renewable. That baseline assumption is changed now. So the new law technically means that even if we don't take additional action, we would achieve 100% renewable electricity supply for the community by 2040. That's not consistent with our CCAP because we likely wouldn't achieve our 2030 emissions reduction with no additional action. And it also it doesn't give us the choice. It doesn't give us choice in kind of like, what does that renewable electricity look like and what other kinds of co-benefits do we want to see from it? So the other component of the House Bill 2021 is that it established this new voluntary renewable energy tariff where cities can pay their utilities at a different rate to get power from a specified set of energy resources to meet our climate action goals or to meet other community goals. So the benefit of utilizing this program is that we can achieve 100% renewable electricity supply on a faster timeline if we wish than what the state requires. And we can also say if there are different types of co-benefits that we'd like to see from that electricity supply. So for example, one of the biggest differentiations that I'm seeing between communities is that there are some communities that say, we want the lowest cost utility scale renewables in order to achieve our 100% renewable goal. Other communities are saying, we want to be 100% renewable, but it's really important to us that we have local community-based resources that can bring economic benefit to our community and create some resiliency benefits. So with this new program, that's the benefit you have, is you can kind of say like, what other things do we want in our electricity supply, and give us a little bit more choice versus just whatever Pacific Power will bring onto the grid to be in compliance with the law. So that's kind of the background. And then Eric Anderson from Pacific Power is going to explain more about that voluntary renewable energy tariff. And then for today, the purpose of today is really just information only. It's a lot of technical information. So we're planning on holding some time for just Q&A with Pacific Power while we have them here. We can also submit questions to them afterwards that they'll get back to us on. So really informational today, just trying to get everyone kind of understanding the option is that we have to move forward with this strategy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric. And were you able to get your slides?
No, my computer privacy settings are stumping me right now and won't let me.
Okay.
So if you wouldn't mind sharing, that
Yes.
would be helpful.
Okay.
Great, and you can go to the next slide. First of all, thank you. That was, you stole a lot of my thunder in that presentation. You said it, there's a lot of real good information in what you said, and we're gonna probably, some of it will sound repetitive. I guess
it was a lot, so it's probably not a bad thing to repeat some of it. It's kind of dense.
So just for, I don't know how your committee normally works, but I am comfortable if we're on an area and we're talking about an area and there's a question that is bringing up, that feel free to, I don't know, raise your hand or just reach out, and am happy to dig in or go down a rabbit hole on any of these issues. My name is Eric Anderson. I am the strategic manager for renewable energy at Pacific Power. Recently, perhaps in the past, for some of you that have been participating for a while, we had another person, Patty Sakowitz, who's was really spearheading this, and I've recently sort of taken this under my wing with the voluntary renewable programs. I would say that these programs have gotten more energy since the legislation that passed in 2021. There was not very much clarity on how to move forward. I would say there's still quite a bit of unknowns about the actual process for moving forward. But now it's quite clear that this type of community-directed energy supply is available in Oregon. So if there were ever any questions whether it could work, we now know that it is approved by the legislature, and we just have to figure out how to make it work. The information on this current slide is information you probably know. We just sort of reiterating that we've been working with you for some time to try and figure out how to make this work. You know, the most current actual standard or goal that we know of from your community is in ES1A, I guess, to achieve 100% renewable supply for the community by 2025. That would be a tricky goal at this point, but I also see the original MOU we had with you from 2019 had a 2030 operation date, probably more achievable, although we can defining what, if we were to move forward with a community energy plan, defining what success means for you is really, it's up to your community to define success and define the goals that we strive for. So I guess, let's go to the next slide. So this is, was also touched, but Pacific Power with our standard energy supply is moving from sort of our historic sort of model that where we had quite a bit of fossil fuels in our mix, as was referenced before. But I think this is relatively new information. We filed it end of last year, and it does show sort of the trajectory that we were headed on even before the 2021 legislative session. So you probably know that, I don't know if you know, but every 2 years we come up with a 20-year planning document called our Integrated Resource Plan, which sort of takes into consideration different environmental rules, costs of new resources, and sort of puts us on a pathway towards keeping the grid running. The last 2 or 3 IRPs have really moved us away from continuing to rely on our existing fossil fuel fleet and transitioning into more renewables. So this representation here covers serving our customers in all 6 states. So some of the more notable issues are, without any action from your community at all, this is what's going to be developed over the next 20 years to help serve our customers. So you can see by 2024, about 3 gigawatts worth of renewables, adding in another 1.3 gigawatts by 2026, and at that time, sort of a significant amount of storage starts to be added into our fuel mix, with an overall goal of by 2040 building, these are all additive, they're cumulative, they're not separate, but by the end of 2040, we'll have added about 10 gigawatts worth of new renewables to our system, and significant amounts of new energy efficiency, building out demand response programs, which are like irrigation load control or industrial plans where we retarget how they use their power, or behind the meter storage solutions. So there's a real focus transitioning from the coal resources, and at the bottom you see retirement of emitting resources, transitioning from those coal resources to renewable resources. And so without any action, even before the legislation, we have the chart on the right, which shows that by 2040, we were going to be at about 83% non-emitting resources. Of those, 62% are actually renewable resources. So that's the path that we had planned in 2021. Let's go to the next slide. In the meantime, Oregon passed the bill that was referenced, HB 2021, and that's sort of a game changer. That was sort of an omnibus energy bill. The sort of headline issue of it is sort of the baseline emission level reductions, that by 2030 we're going to have reduced our emissions level by 80%, and by 2040 we will be using all non-emitting resources. I think, just for sort of nomenclature, the main non-emitting resource that you might be thinking of is hydro. Not all hydro counts as renewable. Old hydro in particular, or large hydro in particular, doesn't typically count as renewable, but it is non-emitting. There's also, in that plan, there is a sort of a new line nuclear plant that is looking to be developed by 2030. So those resources would all come together to get us to comply with this rule, to get to non-emitting resources by 2040. The other things that were referenced in that bill were, most importantly for this discussion, an approval of the community renewable energy tariffs. It's explicitly called out in the legislation. A fund for $50 million to help put together community renewable energy projects. That is run by Odo. There's actually an open proposal, open window for grants right now with $12 million on the table. So there's a lot of state support going into renewables in the near term. It also increased the mandate that we have as a utility to source our power from small scale renewable projects, and rather than only using utility scale projects. Important, but maybe not as germane for today's discussion. It also mandated a clean energy plan as a part of our integrated resource plan, basically so the PUC can make sure we're on the path to meet our new goals. Development of community benefits and impacts advisory groups, which is really sort of focusing our efforts on ensuring that we're talking with communities like we are now to get feedback on how we're doing and what our priorities should be. A study being conducted right now about DOE, from the DOE, about how to encourage small scale renewable energy projects, what the burden or what the challenges are, how we might be able to get more of those projects built in the near term, and some standards for labor standards for renewable energy projects. That will have some impact on cost because it's not quite prevailing wage, but it's guaranteeing that people who move into this space actually are making a living wage. So, HB 21, big deal, changed a lot of how we're going to be doing business. On top of that, we also, the Public Utility Commission, also really clarified how we're supposed to meet that small scale renewable mandate, where in the rule in HB 2021 or in the law, it raised it from 8 to 10%. But then the OPUC clarified what that means. And so what that means is we need to get quite a bit of generation from small facilities, 20 megawatts and below, that are RPS compliant. So the sort of traditional renewable energy resources that you would think. Again, touching on the hydro, it has to be low impact hydro to qualify, which is a certification the projects can get to ensure they're not harming fish and other habitat. But we, under this new rule, we need quite a bit more of these small projects. So even, I guess the reason I'm bringing that up is even without Bend specific action, there's going to be a pretty big move into renewables to meet the targets, and a focus on the development of small scale renewables to meet these mandates. So we're going to be talking about this quite a bit over the next few years. The last one here is, just so you know, the legislature added $10 million into the solar plus storage appropriation. So that program from a few years ago that ran out of money, that actually helps residential customers and low income customers put solar or solar plus storage in, has been refunded at a much higher level than its initial level. So all these things are happening anyways. So next slide. So now we're going to really focus on what a community green tariff might means. The law that approves it says that it is the ability of a community to sort of opt in residential and small commercial customers only. It excludes large commercial or industrial or irrigation customers into a community green tariff. It is, customers are automatically opted in. They do have the ability, simply by calling us, to opt out. The likelihood, well, almost guarantee, is that if a community decides to move forward with this, it will be a bit of a premium. How much of a premium depends on the goals of the community and how the program is structured. So basically, the community makes a choice, opts their customers in to a program. The load that could be covered in Bend is basically the residential and the small commercial portions, for a total eligible load of about 451,000 megawatt hours, and approximately 172 to satisfy that. If we were to do it in a utility scale solar project, you need a relatively large solar facility to meet that need. It would be about 172 megawatts worth. So a pretty big solar project would be sufficient to cover all of that usage for the city of Bend. But I think the important thing here is it doesn't cover all of it. That's about 2/3. Next slide. So this is just a representation of how challenging this that HB 2021 is going to be for the PUC. The PUC has a role here. If in this community green tariff development, there are issues that would be easiest if the PUC sort of opined on how the utility and the communities should work together. I talked with PUC staff this week. They are hoping to still run workshops. They're just really overburdened right now and are trying to prioritize, so they haven't actually gotten something on the schedule. But I would think what they represented is third quarter this year, fourth quarter this year is they'll be able to sort of turn their attention to having some public workshops to help shape this program. So we, and by we, I mean the utility and the city of Bend, should you decide to move forward with this, we can begin laying a lot of the groundwork before that time, but we would need to anticipate that before it actually goes live, there's still a pretty good window of time before this actually goes live, because we are going to need to do this sort of regulatory confirmation process, lock down how we really want the tariff to work, and then submit it. So, in your mind, if we decided to move forward, we're really looking at like a Q1, maybe on the optimistic side, to late Q2 implementation in 2023 as sort of our best case scenario for when we could actually get something moving and actually start sort of seeing direct impacts. So next slide. So there's basically 3 primary models that can be there's levers that can be pulled by a community to meet its goals. First of all, and probably the least cost, is partnering with a large utility scale renewable project. If the goal is simply for the community to just sort of at the lowest cost possible, ensure that the community is taking credit for renewable energy that is hitting the grid and serving customers in Oregon, the probably least cost way to do it is to participate in a partnership with a specific large utility scale solar facility. Your Bend is relatively significant load. There may actually be even larger economies of scale if we can coordinate participation between Bend and say Multnomah County or the city of Portland, or maybe even smaller communities that are interested in this, like Hood River or Talent. But cheapest, biggest bang for the buck to be able to make claims that that get renewable energy credits and the renewable energy retired on behalf of the city of Bend is to partner in this development of a utility scale project. There are communities who want to do more than that and want a more local impact. Rather than really being concerned about just a REC being retired on behalf of the city of Bend, they're more interested in seeing their energy dollars sort of circulate through their local economy. Tends to be like, as sort of the cost effectiveness of the situation tends to be more expensive because smaller projects are more expensive to put in. But the energy dollars are sort of in that community. And facilitate development in that community. How that works, typically it is make a commitment to that you want part of your power, supplied by, say the city of Prineville's biopower plant, or maybe a local irrigations district or conduit hydro project, and where you agree to pay the margin of the additional margin or cost of those facilities to ensure that that power is credited to your community. So that's like sort of option number two. The most flexible option is sort of like community blue sky, where we as a utility go out and find unbundled recs. So it's not actually new renewable there's no guarantee that it's new renewable energy hitting our grid, but it would be renewable energy interconnected somewhere in the West. We get the renewable attributes and retire them on behalf of the community. Most potentially, depending on how your goals are shaped, there might be some topping off of that. If you want to do a little bit of utility scale to keep prices down, you want to do some cool niche local stuff, or some help drive incentives for local installation of solar or something like that. But you have actual targets for energy. You top off with unbundled recs to make sure that you're accurately reflecting your city's goals and meeting those goals. So those are the three sort of primary methods for meeting the goals. Let's go to the next slide. I mean, these are sort of the things that you would want to think about when we're doing sort of the early stage design of your project. What is the actual goal? We have the estimated load per year, we can pull that from meter reads and get you that. In fact, we had that on one of the earlier slides. But the question is, to meet your goal, are you going to count that trajectory that we already have? I mean, you're already sort of paying for that expansion of renewables in your rates. Is the goal that you have to just say, Ben's Energy is doing 100% new cool stuff that we picked? Or is it really, we just want to make up the difference between what the grid is already going to be providing through standard utility practice and that 100% goal? And so that's sort of an important determination, because that will impact the costs of how this works. So it's something to think about. Do you count the grid? Is it a rec-based accounting where you really want recs associated with the retirement, or is it a emissions-free accounting? I think these are all choices that you would get to make as we design this program. There is, I guess that gets to the government specified procurement criteria, which is language straight from the legislation. That is where you get to decide what renewables mean. Is renewables, and there are co-benefits that can be included in that computation. Resiliency, does renewable mean to you a new solar plus storage facility at the local fire department, or or in conduit hydro and the water savings? You're allowed to take all those considerations in to how we structure your goal. Do you want to take into consideration the net metering projects where individuals are acting on their own in your calculations of meeting that goal? So that's something you'll want to think about. There are sort of governance issues about how what entity within the city really runs the program and makes the decisions on the program. Is it this committee, or is it the city council, or the sustainability office? Who makes the long-term choices on how things are going to be decided? I mean, there will be impacts on cost to customers. So as we're designing it, we need to probably really lay out those issues, like who is sort of the responsible entity here. And then, I guess down to pricing components, there are additional costs. There's going to be admin costs. There's going to be a real important one in the legislation was how does this program impact low income customers in the city of Bend? I mean, do you want to opt them in to this program? That's probably unlikely. Most likely they'll have to opt themselves in. That's typically how we see the easy button being. People who we know are sort of are low income would choose to participate. But then then you have to decide, well, how do you set your goal? If your goal is 100% of energy use in Bend, but you don't feel comfortable assigning those additional costs to low income customers, is your goal sort of subtracting that load out or leaving that load in and other customers sort of making up the difference? So those are sort of real questions when we design a program here. Next slide. Here's some of the questions that we really hope the PUC will give us some guidance out on. The low income protections, like I was talking about an easy button. We do anticipate, based on what some of the discussion earlier, that there will be a low income rate in Oregon, which would allow us to leverage that for customers who have signed up for that low income rate to make them opt in. But is that enough for your community? Is that the extent of the low income protections you want to build into your program? There may be others, but we'll know what the PUC thinks is the minimum. Opt-out process and guidelines. What happens if once people's rates start going up and the city of Bend has committed to long-term power purchase agreements with Central Oregon Irrigation District hydropower projects, and 40% of the, I'm making up numbers, it's never this high, but 5 to 10% of the community opts out because they don't like the higher rates. How does that impact the rest of the participants? How does it impact Bend? Those are issues that we'll need to deal with, that the PUC will be hopefully giving us some guidance on. And the other issue here is there needs to be an ordinance somewhere. The city of Bend will have to pass a rule, a law, or something, I don't even know, that says that this is going to apply to our customers in that territory. So getting some more guidance on what that actually looks like. And then this is pretty an important one. How do we really determine what those costs are? What is the premium? And how do we calculate that premium? We will need some guidance on how to work on that. We're working through voluntary renewable energy programs for large industrial customers. Is that formula the right formula when it's a community who's driving the discussion, or are there other sort of externalities that should reduce that cost for the community? That we could use some help with from the PUC. Next slide. So preliminary questions that would be really helpful for you to work on. And I don't think this matters as much for the city of Bend, but we have other places like Hood River, for example, where we have a city that's interested, we have a county that's interested, and we have irrigation districts that are interested, that all overlap in odd ways, all of which, it matters because it determines who's participating. So how does that look? Who's leading it? For you, it seems more clear cut. It's the city of Bend. We sort of can figure out what those guidelines are. And then start to have those discussions about what the specific targets might be for your community, what you're really looking for out of a program like this, what are you trying to solve for, and then we can work on how to make that solution. And then other things like, what about your current residents who are doing blue sky now? Do we take that off the top, or do we let them know that they're going to be part of a community program. So maybe they quit Blue Sky or however, that's sort of up to you. And then the low income protections and what that means to you. Next slide. I think we're getting close to the end. Oh, this is your Blue Sky, or this is your net metering projects and what you're getting from there. And then so already about 23% of your customers looks like already are participating in, well, I guess, oh, that's Hood River. No, I just didn't change that Hood River County. So it's already 23%. Looks like they have some sort of net metering on their facility, and I should double check my presentations before I send them out. Next slide. Oh, this just gives you a whole bunch more nerdy energy person detail on what our fuel mix that is assigned to Oregon is going to look like, and how this is all based on the 2021 IRP. It hasn't taken into consideration a House Bill 2021 yet, but this shows you how we're transitioning out of coal, on these top lines, and gas on these top lines, and how we're moving into these other technologies like nuclear, hydro, wind, solar. So you can get, if you really want to understand what our plan is right now, here's what we have in front of the Oregon Commission. In 2023, we'll be doing it all again. And that will then it will show a slightly different number, because instead of total non-emitting being 85% like it is, it will be 100%. But we were already in the middle of our planning cycle when that legislation came out. And but by 2023, this will be slightly different as we take into those new goals. I don't know. I think it's probably time to open up the table and see if there's questions. I bet there might be.
What's the complicated part?
Well, if you decide to move forward with us, we'll get to see each other quite a bit. It will probably be me and one other person, and Matt. You've probably met our regional. We'll probably be in like almost weekly meetings with you, trying to iron out these issues. It is a big task, and you're probably one of the early adopter, are in our service territory. I would say most likely it will be us working with you, Hood River, Multnomah County, and on the PGE side, Milwaukee. Those are the cities that are really sort of, are the locations that are really sort of interested in this off the top. So we'll all sort of be working together to figure out where we can find commonalities that make it easier for all of us, I guess.
And really quick before we get into questions, maybe just check in with Neil and Serena, because not surprisingly, we're running low on time. And I think we do need to hold a little time for kind of agenda review and talking about our next meeting. So yeah, I was thinking maybe we can ask like 1 or 2 questions, but it may be best as far as questions to either we can maybe plan some time in the next meeting. We can submit questions to Pacific Power, and perhaps we can ask them to come back for a longer Q&A if we feel like that's warranted. But what do you think, I guess, Neil, as far as like just 1 or 2 questions now and then kind of move on to preparing for the next meeting? Or
yeah, I was going to make the same comment. We have had a very jam-packed agenda, and this was a really good intro, Eric. I think the combination of resources that we've had and this presentation really solidify, and I think caught a lot of us back up. So yeah, I think we have time for a solid question that's necessary, and then we can, this is just the beginning of a long conversation, so we don't need to dive into details or look back at graphs or anything like that. Do you want to make that comment, Mark?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll try to be as quick as possible. I think, Eric, the way you were presenting this, you probably were addressing my concern, but is it true that we are we can be sure that we are only paying for the incremental increase in renewable generation. It seems as if all of what you were showing in terms of the existing renewable share of consumption in Bend, what that trajectory mix will look like going to the future. That say that 172 megawatt solar project that we would talk about, we would only be, for that equivalent, paying the incremental cost relative to an incremental change in renewable sourced electricity consumed in Bend. So we're not double paying for any renewable share of our mix, and we're not paying for renewable that might be already being paid for elsewhere by, say, shuffling around where we account for the consumption. It seems like what you're describing is that there would be careful accounting, that any incremental payment we make above and beyond current rates and financial payments corresponds to an incremental increase in generation. Is that all true?
Yes. So first of all, the amount of the increase, one thing is how we establish the goal. So there's, are you just trying to move up from our 60% and pick up that last 40%? So that's a super important consideration, like how we define the goal. But then after we get there and you figure out you need 100 megawatts worth of solar, basically how that works in VRET, we got to confirm that it's the same methodology here. VRET is for the larger customers. We bring on 100 megawatts worth of solar, right? And you pay for what that 100 megawatts of solar, but then you get a credit back. So you end up like the contract looks weird. It's like, say it's 100 meg, it's 5 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that. But you're providing a benefit to the system that's equal to 3.9 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that. So you pay that margin between the 5 cents and the 3.9 cents or what, those are just make-believe numbers that may be representative of what solar costs versus value to the system. So yeah, you get credit for, you're bringing a new renewable resource to us. And we're going to use that to help other things. So you're going to get credit for the value that brings to the system, which reduces that cost to you guys, to the community. So it's just that you pay the bump, the delta between what you're bringing to the system, the energy and the capacity benefits you're bringing to the system as versus the cost. So you get that credit. So yeah, it's a little complicated, but really it's just you pay the margin in there and how that margin is calculated, or that delta is calculated. I think that's where we'll get a little bit of PUC sort of clarity on are we doing that right?
Yeah, exactly. That delta, and being sure that we're just paying for the delta and not, say, already paying in some fixed costs or sunk costs of non-renewable sources with the same dollars. So yeah, thanks.
All right, great. Thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us in the presentation, Eric. We look forward to working with you moving forward.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. Happy to talk in the future.
Thanks,
and
Eric.
I'll look forward to the questions.
Yeah.
And will you update those slides and make sure that data is correct, and then send that back out to Cassie? Okay, great.
Yep, I sure will.
All right, well, jumping right along, Cassie, we have some report outs and then that important agenda review component left. So with our limited time remaining, what do you think we should do first?
I kind of think we should do an agenda review because we don't have huge updates, I think, from any of the groups. And we have some opening in our next meeting.
Perfect. Do you have a slide for that?
Yes, I have. I'll show a slide and then I can also pull up our bike rack spreadsheet, which I'm sorry I didn't send out. We'll send that out next time. So the only mandatory item for next month is we're going to have a presentation from our long range planning staff about the climate friendly and equitable community rulemaking and kind of the status on that and what that looks like. And it's important that you all hear the background on that because as that becomes the new law, and this committee may have to be involved with some of the next steps of those rules. And so it's just important to get the background on that. But other than that, we don't have, we have some opening in our agenda. So I think we wanted to discuss if there are any bike rack items you guys want to talk about, if there's any of the CCAP projects you guys want to talk about. And then this optional one is that we also had an option from our long range planning group that there is some planning. I sent you guys an email about this a couple of weeks ago, but there's planning going down in a new area in the southeast part of town that was recently kind of brought into the city. And long range planning is going and giving presentations to all committees on that project and getting input if there's interest in kind of understanding what's going to happen out there and what kind of planning there is. I put it as optional for us. To me, it seemed like there might be interest from the committee in focusing on other things. But if kind of diving into some of that land use stuff is interesting for this committee, we could have a presentation on that as well. But I think I'll turn it back to you, Neil, but I think the discussion is to see how we want to fill that agenda time. And I will pull up our Excel doc with community topics that we've started to aid in that.
Yeah, so this is kind of the opportunity for the group to, we have that agenda time. We promised that we would provide that time when it was available. So then we could work on what we thought was important as a group. So yeah, so those, just as a reminder of what Cassie said, there's the option of the Stevens Road project and weighing in or learning more about that, or jumping in and having more discussion about one of the other CCAP topics or bike rack topics that we think is important. So this is an open invitation to the group for what you think would be an important use of that committee time.
And this is in addition to our regular general reoccurring subgroup report outs, just so you guys know as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rena.
That is a standing agenda item. Thank you.
Or we can just take that time back and have a short meeting.
We could also use some of that time to talk about what we just heard about and come up if there's some group questions. So that's another option that's not on the bike rack, but just throwing that out there.
Bill?
Well, what you just said, Cassie, I think makes some sense. There was that was a very intense, information intense presentation, and there's so many components to it. I'm not. It might be good to follow up and think about what it is, how we understand it. What he threw a lot of questions to us, and maybe discussing some of those might be useful. I mean, it looks like the timeline is out there in 2023, but these things all have a way of creeping up on you in a hurry. I had a lot of questions, but I think that might be a good suggestion to at least take a little time in there and have us think about this between this meeting and next, and maybe have a bigger discussion about what in the world we need to do. So I think that would be a useful thing to do, as Cassie suggested.
Sounds good, Bill. Covey?
I was just trying to find, I feel like there was a time map that we had, Cassie had shared previously in one of the meetings regarding which actions from CCAP we were going to be tackling in which month. And I felt like we had something scheduled for each month or meeting. And I just want to make sure that if there's an opportunity to move forward on some actions, that we take that opportunity if we have the time. So I support that. I'm happy to have a discussion on what we just heard about too, but I don't know if we are close to a decision on that. So I don't know where the timeline on that is yet. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, so here's the timeline. I mean, I think for quarter 2, 2022, we're supposed to be in, still the research and analysis phase for the revolving loan funds, which we're doing, the home energy score. We're not quite starting the public engagement, so we're kind of still in the research and analysis phase for that. The 100% renewable electricity is what we had scheduled to be discussing now. And then the energy efficiency, the main part of that action is kind of complete. So I think we're on track, and that the 100% renewable electricity supply is kind of, part of that. I think we have the subgroup. It's Peter and Bill make up that subgroup, so we can handle some of the discussions about some of the next steps just within that subgroup, and then maybe bring something a little bit more tangible back to the committee to kind of discuss, rather than having something open, because it is a complicated topic. But we didn't have starting the waste ones until, the second part of the year, which is right around the corner, of course.
Yeah, thanks for that context, Cassie. Kelly?
I was just going to comment that, it's super helpful to hear from various organizations or departments within the city to understand the impact, but it would be super helpful to understand that in terms of the land use and resources roadmap. There's continuous development. And so how are we thinking about kind of all of these in relation to land use, which was, I think, at the bottom of the list of the previous slide.
And I do think the climate friendly and equitable rules will definitely begin a discussion about that. And I think that will be a lot of time for Q&A that could kind of, it's not going to be general land use education, but I think that'll be part of the discussion. And a lot of our approach to land use is currently changing with those new rules, which we're still kind of trying to understand and grasp. So if we wanted them to come and do something kind of more general about land use, we could maybe ask them to do that as well during that time. But I don't, but I think a lot of our CCAP projects currently don't really delve into land use specifically, and the climate friendly and equitable rules are kind of, we'll understand better after the presentation next week how climate is being integrated into land use and being required to do that by the state. So it may be useful to get that presentation first and then kind of figure out what what kind of additional background we'd like to hear from that group and how it fits into the other, work that we're doing right now.
So to generally sum things up, it sounds like we heard recommendations to continue diving into the 100% renewable energy supply, potentially with a subgroup of people meeting before that, so then it can be a little bit more focused. But then also, Kelly, is that question about kind of land use and how we engage in that, do you think that would be captured under the climate friendly equitable communities conversation, or the connection to Stevens Road, or is that just one of the general recommendations or of a topic that you wanted to bring up next week?
Yeah, I mean, this topic keeps popping up, whether it's, we address it in the COID, there's various tracts of land that are in development. And so I think just understanding how those are being considered along with these other presentations like power and water, tree use, whatever it may be, that we're constantly revisiting this topic and addressing as needed.
Mm-hmm. So those seem like the general pieces that have been brought up. Do we, but we need to pick one to do for the next meeting. So do we have, is that an official recommendation, Kelly, to just have that broader discussion about land use?
Yeah, and maybe it's a follow-up after Cassie's recommendation of hearing from the equitable communities. Maybe it's a follow-up discussion of whether we need to do a deeper dive into that or if it's being adequately covered.
Okay. Well, then maybe if that is a follow-up from that, we can have some of that conversation as a part of that. And then if there's space to bring that or specific questions beyond that, we can do that. All right.
Can I ask I just had a question for maybe Kelly and Neil. From the land use perspective, sometimes what comes up is a project, which would be like COID or Stevens Road, that tract. Those would be land use questions related to what information do you want on a pending project? And if you want information like for Cassie to figure out how does that fit in, that would be talking to our planning department. If what you're interested in is the status and weighing in on code amendments, that's kind of a different question. Like, where are we with the landscaping code? That's a council policy decision on what staff capacity and what is the council policy direction to different staff on should we be drafting codes. And I guess I'm not quite clear on which you're most interested in or both. I will say in April, there's going to be revisiting with council their council goals. And in internal meetings with the city manager, we are constantly saying, we don't know what staff capacity there will be until we revisit with council in April, the council goals. So I'm just kind of asking, which do you see as most important for the ECC for background knowledge? Does that make sense? That distinction between like the climate and friendly and equitable rules, that will mostly be code related as that gets implemented more than projects. Or maybe you're interested in both. It's just different staff. Like when I hear you talk about things, I'm thinking, oh, we need to get Colin in front of them. And then you have another question and I think, oh, we might need Russ Grayson, who's more like at the city manager level. So I'm not always quite sure what it is that you're the most interested in. So maybe,
Yes, I'm thinking about this in part, it's probably both, but in part projects, thinking about how the projects are integrating some of these initiatives of the various departments.
maybe that's something Cassie and I can talk about offline and figure out what's the best way to get you the information that you want with the right staff.
And I have a proposition maybe for next week, since we're out of time, is that we'll hear the climate friendly and equitable rulemaking update, maybe because it's a relevant topic. And I don't think that presentation is super long and we don't have a lot of other stuff. We can plan on having just a little bit of general discussion and hearing. We can just kind of talk about some of that stuff in general and maybe having more time to hear your questions and understand them better. Then that might give like me and Mary a little bit more direction about what we can bring back to you guys. So I think we can hold a little extra time on that topic. But I think then because we don't have something really specific to talk about with that, then I think we still have time to maybe follow up on, and because I haven't heard anything else, I think we would maybe follow up on this presentation that we just heard. So I can meet with Bill and Peter in the interim to just try to digest a little bit. And then I think we'll want to have a discussion with you all to first hear like what questions do we want to submit to Pacific Power, because I think we should all have a million questions. Or at least I have a million questions. I'm assuming some other people have at least a couple questions. And then we can maybe start working through like just the big picture. Like, do you guys think that what he described, is there a role for that, in our community? Is that something we're interested in even a little bit? Some of those big picture questions. So that's what I would propose.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. And I'm seeing some nods around the Zoom table. So thanks for consolidating that thought, Cassie. And our kind of updates or report outs we can push to the next meeting as well. And if there's, I think some of those are relevant or are if there's more information in those report outs, we always have the option of writing a quick memo and sending that out ahead of time too. So then we can use our time most effectively. So with that, is there anything else for the good of the order, knowing that we're at time? And we had to skip a couple items in the agenda, which we normally don't do, but we also took care of our business first, which was really great. So I'm happy for us to go over rather than guess every time. Sorry, guess. Anything else for the good of the order?
I do have something. I just one thing he brought up was about the small scale or the community renewable projects, and there's 50 million bucks is to do that. Is Ben doing anything with looking toward getting any of that money? And it looks like it's the timeline is till June is June. So I'm just curious. We don't need to talk about it, but it's something. I guess some follow-up might be interesting to see if there's any interest in the city or if anybody's taken that up.
Yeah, we're definitely looking at it, and we're trying to figure out if we have any projects ready to go for the June deadline. If not this round, certainly future rounds.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you all for all your great work in this meeting and outside of it, and we will see you next month, if not beforehand.
Thanks, everyone.